Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's seminar on risk management for volunteer managers. This seminar is jointly organized by Law Society Pro Bono Services as well as SG Care's office. My name is Kellyn and I'll be your moderator for today. To briefly introduce myself, I'm a senior associate from Drew and Napier's Dispute Resolution Department, and I mainly handle litigation and arbitration matters. So it's very nice to finally be in a live event. For those of you who do not know, this is a hybrid session. We have with us volunteer managers from SG Care's volunteer centers and also those online with us via Zoom. So before we begin, there are a few housekeeping matters that I would like everyone to take note of. The first is regarding Q&A. So we will be using Pigeonhole Live, and you can submit your questions to the panel of speakers, and you can also vote on any questions that has been asked by other people that you would like to get answered. So if you have a smartphone or a tablet with you, you can launch your internet browser and enter the website seen on the screen, which is www.pigeonhole.at, and the event passcode is SG Cares. So alternatively, if you are watching via Zoom, you can click on the link that's being shared on the chat function right now, and that should be able to help you launch your Pigeonhole Live. So you may submit your questions at any point in time throughout this seminar, and we'll try our best to answer them throughout the seminar. So the second point is that please note that today's discussion is not meant to constitute legal advice. If you require any professional legal advice, please separately consult a lawyer. So now that we are done with the housekeeping matters, let us begin our seminar proper. So it's my pleasure to be here today with our distinguished guests to discuss risk management strategies for volunteer managers. And as we all know, volunteers are indeed a very important resource to charities, to SSAs, and but volunteer involvement also comes with certain risks, such as legal risks and reputational risks. So today we will discuss risk management practices that SSAs as well as volunteer managers can adopt to manage such risks. So to kickstart today's program, we will first have an opening address by the Deputy Secretary, Community and Youth of MCCY, Mr. Philip Ng. And after that, we will have Ms. Aurill Kam, who will briefly speak about the key areas of litigation risk. We'll then have a panel discussion with Aurill and Dr. Vincent Ng, where we will walk through a few case scenarios so that we can see what kinds of situations volunteer managers and charities may encounter. And last but not least, we'll finish off with a Q&A session. So let's get today's session going, and may we now invite DS Mr. Philip Ng on stage to give the opening address. Mr. Ng, please.
Mr. Tong Yi Lim, our SG Care's Volunteer Center representatives, and also the representatives from non-profit organizations who are joining us online. First of all, I want to say I'm very happy to be able to join you at this seminar on managing risk for volunteer managers, organized by the Law Society Pro Bono Services in partnership with SG Cares. Volunteers, like was mentioned just now, are a very important integral part of the non-profit sector, right? They augment the manpower capabilities of our non-profits. They help to improve service delivery, and they're key to growing a caring culture and a stronger society. We know our volunteers give of their best, but because they're also engaging and dealing with multiple stakeholders, there are risks involved, right? So it is important for us to know how to manage those risks in order to protect our volunteers, the beneficiaries, service users, as well as the reputations of the non-profit organizations that deploy them. So this is what today's seminar is about. It is about managing risks. And we hope that through this seminar today, we will be able to equip our volunteer centers, NPOs, as well as volunteer managers like yourselves on how best to identify, assess, and mitigate those risks. Right. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Tongi and his team for and all the professional setup that I actually can see in front of me for pulling this thing together after getting feedback from the volunteer centers at our community networking session back in April. So thank you very much. I'm also looking very much forward to listening to Kellyn and Aurill, our lawyers, for sharing their time and expertise to level up our capabilities in this very important area. And we also have with us Dr. Vincent Ng from AMKFSC Family Services Ltd. He will be sharing the NPO perspective on best practice as well as insights about how to manage risks for volunteer managers. So without further ado, I just want to say one more thing is that looking ahead, we'll be working again with legal society, pro bono services, as well as our other community partners to try to have more seminars like this, right, on specific issues that NPOs and volunteer centers think are important to them and will help to level up their capability. And so you have any ideas on what these seminar topics ought to be, please let us know and we will follow up accordingly. So I'll just hand the time over back to Kellyn.
Thank you, DS. Indeed, we hope that this session will be helpful for everybody to be able to identify, assess, and mitigate such risks that you may face in your everyday jobs. So our panel today consists of Ms Aurill Kam and Dr. Vincent Ng, as mentioned. So just to briefly introduce each of them, Aurill is a director with the law firm called Clinic LLC. She's a senior litigator with around 30 years of experience, spanning both private practice and public service. She has advised on numerous cases throughout her career, including complex civil commercial cases, regulatory enforcement, and public law matters. Her public service experience includes heading 2 different departments at MAS and also being Deputy Chief Counsel at the AGC Civil Division. So next we have Vincent. Vincent is the CEO of AMKFSC Community Services. And during his time there, he has transformed the organization into a multi-service agency that enhances and enriches the lives of disadvantaged communities in Singapore. Beyond his responsibilities as CEO, Vincent also serves on the MediFund Committee of National Neuroscience Institute, Board of Visitors for Adult Disability Homes, Panel of Assessors on National Council on Problem Gambling, National Council of Social Services Leadership Selection Panel, Social Work Advisory and Accreditation Board, and on the National Center of Infectious Disease Resilience Fund Committee. Vincent also holds a PhD in social work from NUS and was a recipient of the Outstanding Social Worker Award in 2017. He has also been a social service fellow and a master practice leader since 2015 and serves as an adjunct faculty member at NUS and SUSS. So before we begin the panel discussion, Aurill will give an overview on the key areas of litigation risk relating to volunteer involvement. May we now invite Aurill up on stage for the presentation.
Thanks, Kellyn. Hi, everyone. Great to be here. You know, there is a saying that ignorance is bliss. And then there is another saying which goes, information is power. So by virtue of the fact that you're here, I take it that you are a subscriber of the second view, that information and knowledge is power. And indeed, that is true of many things, right? Especially when you think about the management of legal risk. Because until you know what the legal requirements are, we're not going to be able to appreciate what the risks are. And until we are able to appreciate what the risks are, we're not sure how we can actually change or think about the day-to-day work that we do. So it is really with this in mind that we're having this talk, I would call, not so much a presentation, meant to be a two-way discussion. We want to have this dialogue together so that we can look at how some of these legal requirements and rules, increase the risks that we're exposed to when we go about our day-to-day work, and then what we can do to better manage these areas. We will deal, in the time that we have, just 10 minutes, deal with 3 very broad areas. Can I have a change of slides? Yes. So I want to talk about forms of legal liability, legal risk management and best practices, and then to say a few words about the different forms of dispute resolution. All right, so let's start with forms of legal liability. When lawyers talk about legal liability, it's really just answering the question, under what circumstances can you be made liable? All right, so next slide. Okay, here, let's deal first with criminal liability. So you see 4 different forms: criminal, regulatory, statutory, and then there's something called civil liability. I have put criminal liability and regulatory liability in the same pocket because these types of liability, if you like, they are owed to the state. So for instance, in criminal liability, if one breaches a criminal law or criminal statute like the Penal Code or certain provisions like the Charities Act that carry with them criminal sanctions, then you will be looking at investigations by the police, prosecution by the public prosecutor, and then eventually, if there is going to be any sanctions meted out, it could be jail, it could be fine, but basically the obligation is imposed by the state, all right? Now, regulatory liability is a little bit like criminal liability in the sense that if somebody is found to have breached a statute, and again, it's based on a statute law, if somebody is found to have breached a statute like the Charities Act or the PDPA, certain consequences follow. And when we talk about regulatory liability, it could be something like what we call an administrative fine. It could be something like a revocation of a license, or you might get suspended, license might get suspended, conditions may be imposed on the voluntary organization that you can or cannot do certain things. So those are the types of regulatory sanctions, right? So again, they're like criminal liability because they stem from a statute, and if there's liability found, it is a government organization or the state that will impose it. You have something called statutory torts. Non-lawyers always tell me it sounds like a tort cake, right? Now, statutory torts, as the name suggests, it is again based on the statute. So we talked earlier about statutes that give rise to criminal liability and regulatory liability. Some statutes will also provide in the law books that if there is a breach of the provision, then aggrieved persons can actually take remedial steps and seek court orders to protect their rights or to get compensation. So examples of these types of statutes would be, you'd be surprised, the PDPA. PDPA actually has a provision to say that if there is a breach of the act, then an aggrieved person can actually go to court and sue the contravening person and say, I want damages, all right? But very few people actually do that because, it's just really not worth the trouble, right? The other one that, that comes to mind in terms of a statutory tort would be something like your Protection from Harassment Act, right? So if somebody who's been harassed can go to court and ask for a protection order, for instance. So these are the different forms of statutory torts. And then finally, we have civil liability. Civil liability, unlike criminal or regulatory liability that is owed to the state, is really just owed to private citizens. So For instance, in any breach of contract claim or claim under the tort or the law of negligence, it would be individual A suing individual B and, asking for a monetary order or some kind of an injunction. Those types of things are called civil liability. All right, next slide. Okay, so I've mentioned this, that in criminal liability, the sanctions would usually be a fine. It could be imprisonment. The one thing I do want to highlight is that you can have corporate as well as individual criminal liability. So from the perspective of, say, volunteer managers, you might ask, how, am I ever exposed? Well, usually not, because the law is going to be very strict about when it will impose criminal liability on an individual for the criminal acts of the corporation. All right. So we're not talking here about an individual committing theft or something like that. We're talking here about, let's say, an organization committing a crime like money laundering. Then can the individuals while working in the organization become liable? Answer is, for some crimes, yes, because the law has a mechanism for saying that if you are a person who has the ability to prevent, let's say, a crime from taking place, and you did not, right? Then the law attributes individual liability. But that's usually quite strict, and it doesn't apply to all criminal offenses. Usually you look in the statute books for a particular provision that says, maybe a director or a manager or someone in senior management position could possibly be made liable. Right, but that still means that as individual working in organizations, we need to be careful. We can't sort of take on the mentality of, well, if somebody is criminally liable, it's the board. It doesn't matter. I can close my eye to wrong things that I see happening around me. Not so. Yeah, it doesn't necessarily follow. But don't get too freaked out by it too, because it doesn't happen in all cases. It doesn't happen in relation to all criminal offenses. All right. Right. Next slide. Okay, so I just wanted to very quickly talk about some provisions about the Charities Act, which may apply to some of you, may not apply to some of you, but just to know them in a very general way. There is an obligation under the Charities Act to keep proper accounts and accounting records. Now, this is usually imposed on the governing board and the directors, all right? But the second one, and that's important because that is a provision that covers any person. So it doesn't just apply to directors and people in charge, it covers any person. It is an offense to supply false or misleading statements to the COC. Actually, as a general rule, just remember this. There is always some provision tucked somewhere that will make it a criminal offense for any of us to supply false, misleading information to any public officer. Okay, so if you remember that as a general rule of thumb, you should be safe. Right. For those of us who work with the finance side of things, and I don't think there would be so many in this group, they would be familiar with the regulations on the use of donations, proper receipts and things like that. And again, those ones would carry criminal sanctions if there are breaches. So I won't delve too much into those. Next slide. I want to talk about the PDPA. So PDPA, we should be alive to, because I would reckon that in the course of our work, we may come across personal data. So personal data under the PDPA is quite broadly defined, right? Anything that, if you like, helps you identify a person would prima facie, and I'm just speaking very broadly because I don't want to go into too much technicalities, would be considered personal data under the PDPA. So a person's phone number, NRIC number, address, and even photograph, right? Those things would be considered personal data under the PDPA. So there is a duty on the part of organizations to protect personal data by making, and I emphasize the words, reasonable security arrangements. All right. It's not absolute, but it's reasonable security arrangements. Now, that said, if you follow the news and all that, you will see that every time there is a security breach, there are pretty hefty fines imposed by the PDPC. So my personal take on it is that it's not that difficult for the commission to make out and to find that there has been a lapse or a failure to set up reasonable security arrangements. Okay. The other thing to sort of bear in mind is that, of course, if you are an employee or a volunteer working in an organization that collects personal data, you are permitted to have access to that information. But any breach by the volunteer or the employee becomes something that the organization is liable for. And therefore, if you think about it from a volunteer manager's point of view or the institution's point of view, you still need to have safeguards, right? You still need to have some protocol on who should have access to personal data, how you protect that data, what sort of code of conduct you should impose in terms of the handling of the data. What should you do if you find that there's a data breach? These are all important things to think about. They go towards making your case of whether you have put up reasonable security arrangements, right? And also let's remember, I mean, if we took a back seat and consider how a commission might look at this if there has been a breach, I think I would argue as a lawyer, if I have to defend someone, you know, who's breached the PDPA, I would say that the more robust your security arrangements, the more you have done to prevent breaches, but even if notwithstanding that there's been a breach, but the more you have done, I think that would be a huge mitigant in your favor when you say to the authorities, please, you know, give me a lower fine, right? You will be punished, but obviously, but you want to hope for, you know, some leniency in view of the good that you have done, so to speak. The second bullet point is about how far, you know, the financial penalty can be. It can go up to $1 million. I think if we look back to most of the sanctions, apart from one or two, Sync Health, I think, had a really big one that was imposed on them, but most of them are not very, very hefty fines. But, you know, again, one should not take comfort in that, because it's not just the imposition of the financial penalties, it is also the directions that the PDPC can impose on the organization. So they may say no more collection of personal data for you guys until you clean up your act. Now that would be very serious, right? Or it could actually stifle your operations if you get directions that restrict and curb your ability to do what you're supposed to do. So beyond the financial penalties, we want to make sure that we are very compliant with the PDPA, because it could really restrict our ability to function. Yeah. This one I mentioned, the third bullet point, that the persons who are who suffered damage as a result of the breach of the PDPA can actually bring an action, but I'm not aware of any having been brought. Yeah. Okay. Next slide. Okay, civil liability, just very quickly. I mean, this would be cases brought by individual parties for acts of negligence, sometimes for trespass. Trespass meaning if, let's say, you brought, you know, people out on a trip or something like that, and a hike, and one of your beneficiaries got assaulted by a volunteer, then, you know, potentially the beneficiary could sue in trespass and assault against the volunteer. So these are what we call tortious liability claims, yeah, civil liability claims. Okay, next slide. The remedies in civil liability claims, just very quickly, they tend to be monetary in nature, and sometimes the court can also give injunction if a case is made out. An injunction is an order that will prohibit an individual or a company from doing certain things, right? It's sort of like a restraining order, right? Let's move on. Okay, risk management. So now that we understand where liability can arise, let's say a few things about how we can manage the risk. And I want to be very clear about this, that we can only mitigate, manage, reduce risk. We can never eliminate risk, right? So everything that we talk about here today will be about trying to reduce, manage, right? And DS said, identify the risks so you know what you can do to reduce them, but we can never eliminate them. All right. Let's think about, a few groups of people, our stakeholders, so to speak. Yeah. What can we do to manage legal risks for our volunteers? Of course, we want to show them as much love as we can, but we also need to think, in terms of protection for them and for the beneficiaries and for the organization. So, do we need to have terms of conduct? Do we need some simple rules of conduct so that their expectations are clear? When I say expectations, I'm referring to their expectations on the organization, their expectations of their dealings between each other, and their expectations of beneficiaries, right? Where is the line? When is going too far with a client or a beneficiary that they're providing support to? So rules of conduct, that's really quite important. Another very important thing, volunteers need to know that they have no authority to represent the organization, right? They're there to do certain things, but if somebody wants some kind of assurance or a statement from the organization, volunteers need to understand that they can't actually give those assurances. What about certain policies that you should put in place, that you should make known to the beneficiaries, like anti-harassment policies? I mean, I love it sometimes when I go to places and, they'll put up these really nice signs telling you, we do the best we can, but please don't raise your voices with our staff, or be rude to our staff. And then some management will go a little step further and say, if you are, you may be removed from the premises, right? I think it sounds harsh, but it's actually necessary, but maybe not necessary in all cases. But we know that in some of the services that are run, there will be a higher likelihood that you will meet irritable people who are already on edge, and that's where they need to be reminded, and we need to do that to protect our volunteers. What about whistleblowing policies, right? We need to be mindful that, despite best efforts and despite our doing our very best, sometimes there are just human errors and human failures, people who abuse their position. We should give volunteers and everyone who works with us, and even beneficiaries, the ability to safely be able to anonymously whistleblow and know that they won't feel or face repercussions, right? So these are some policies to think about, and letting people know. It's really funny. I mean, not just in volunteer organizations, sometimes even in corporate organizations, you've got all these beautiful, great policies that are written out, anti-harassment, whistleblowing, but nobody knows about it. And then on the ground, you hear stories of people saying, I've been discriminated against. And, when you say to them, why don't you go and complain? But I'm not aware that there's a complaint channel, right? So expectations, very important. Communication, very important. Okay. Yes, this again, mitigating risk of loss of items in your premises. How do you mitigate against personal injury in your premises, or during activities that you carry out, right? Some things you can remind people, some things you can do yourself. So for instance, next slide, be conscious about where you may have to put out certain signages, barricades to protect people, remind them that the floor is slippery. Do your recce properly if you are going to be carrying out certain activities, and I'm sure all of you do that, right? And you're mindful of especially the more vulnerable, weaker beneficiaries for whom you must take additional care. So I I had to do a legal clinic once, and I was dealing with a case, and the case was really very simple. I mean, these were guys who were taking some kids out for a campfire, and they've done it a million times, you know, no issues. But this one time, for some reason, they know that when they put out, when they start the campfire, so to speak, they need to get people, you know, a certain distance away. So there is a radius, right, for which you got to keep people out. And this one time there was a slip, and this boy went a little bit too close, and then he got scotched, right? Very unpleasant for everybody. But, you know, when you sort of take a step back after an unfortunate event like that has happened, you would be saying to yourself, actually, there was a little bit more I could have done, knowing that in this particular case, I was going to be with 6 to 10-year-olds, right? So, and the person who was running the activity said to me, yeah, we did everything, but maybe the one thing we could have done better was to have just a few more people standing around and making sure that no one went in accidentally. So these are some of the things to think about. I would say that sometimes, you know, the more you have done an activity, the greater sort of comfort level, and the more you are at risk of missing out on important points like that. Okay, next slide. Yeah, I was going to say, put up signs by all means, but don't be like this management. Yeah, if you can't read this, it says management is not responsible for anything at all. Okay, all right. Okay, so we do our best. We do our best to avoid risks and all that. But what happens if, notwithstanding best efforts, people get into a squabble? You know, you find that you are at the receiving end of a suit or something like that. And this is where I say we, you know, need to take a very balanced approach. I find that there tends to be two camps. One camp would be extremely legalistic. They go strictly by the law and they say, I'm not going to speak to you anymore. You know, an event has occurred. I'm going to protect my position. Everything will be by lawyer's letter. And then you have another camp that will say, no, you can't do that. You know, it's just unacceptable. And therefore we throw caution to the wind and we will make apologies immediately, etc. Right. And I advocate that a balance has to be drawn, because you have to show compassion. You have to show, obviously, some level of sympathy, because if you don't, you are just telling the other person, please sue me. So you got to do that. But you also have to be sure that there are certain sort of OB markers that you are, you know, marking, right? So, we need to realize that any concession, any admission made, if you are going to make any admission, it must be done, and I say on a considered basis. I'm not saying that you cannot make admissions or apologies, but it's got to be considered. Most times lawyers will tell you, please do it on the without prejudice basis, so that if for whatever reason, whatever you're offering is rejected and you get sued in court, this is not, you know, taken against you. But I say again, this is a considered decision that no volunteer on his own should make, and which is why there has to be a protocol for escalation. There has to be a protocol for the person in the correct position to make that call. Do we admit? Do we, you know, offer compensation? What do we do? How do we do it, right? Be aware of time and claim limitations. There are time limitations to certain types of claims. Personal injury is actually 3 years. Other types of claims are 6 years. Seek legal advice early, not because lawyers want to make money, but seriously, seek legal advice early. It's not always the case that if you go and get legal advice, it would be a lawyer's letter. Very often, if lawyers really care about the issue, they will help you find a way to resolve it amicably while protecting your position. But if you go in too late and you've already sort of lined up the position, it becomes very hard to backpedal. Okay, so that's the reason for seeking legal advice earlier. And then manage the process. Manage the process. By this, I mean, if you've had an accident, and I'm sure all of you do that, but it bears repeating, right? If there's been an incident, there's got to be some communication. The worst thing for say the parents of a child who's been injured, is to know that, oh, my child went for the activity, they brought him to the hospital, they brought him back home, and then after that, I didn't hear from the organization for, 7 days, right? In that 7 days, mom, dad could have decided to take some drastic steps already, right? So manage the process. Yeah. Now I'm just very quickly going to talk about the different modes of dispute resolution. Don't want to spend too much time. There is litigation. Okay, litigation is one mode. Litigation, basically, you are going to get that dispute resolved in court. It will be before a judge. It will be an adversarial process. There will be a winner. There will be a loser. There will be legal costs involved. Not advisable in most cases. Let's try to avoid litigation as much as we can when we are confronted with a dispute. We only go for it if we really have to. There's a lot of publicity as well. We don't want that, right? Arbitration. Arbitration is like litigation. There is an adjudication, but the judge is not a court judge. It would be a party appointed judge. Arbitration normally would not work in the kind of scenarios that we're talking about for volunteers, volunteer organizations, because they're usually in the contract already. When parties enter into a contract, they agree that if we have a dispute, we will go to arbitration. So just so you know, you can file away. Arbitration has an advantage in that it is confidential. Right? Arbitration proceedings are confidential, unlike court proceedings where reporters can walk in and write sensational stories. Okay, this one I think worth spending time on, mediation. Mediation becoming a very, very important part in the legal landscape in Singapore. It's wonderful for resolving disputes, and especially important, again, I think, for your space, because if you do find yourself at the end of a suit or threatened suit, I think mediation is what you should be trying in the very first instance as early as possible to try to get it resolved. In mediation, parties agree to go to an independent party, third party, who will try to get parties to reach a compromise, right? You might end up with, an apology or a payment of a small sum, but it's a compromise that is agreed to between the two sides. And at the end of the agreement, there will be a settlement agreement drawn up, right? Where the party that has a claim will say, okay, I drop all claims. And, you do this, ABC, I drop all claims. That's the end of the matter. So this is a great way to resolve low dollar value suits or claims for which there could be a lot of adverse reputational, consequences, a lot of adverse publicity. This is what we go for, right? And this is something that is worth doing. There are many mediation outfits now, that should be something you should think about. Okay, I think that's it for the presentation. Yeah.
Tess. Thank you, Aurill, for the very informative presentation. So please take a seat while we invite Vincent up on stage as well for the panel discussion. So as a reminder to our audience, you can submit your questions via Pigeonhole Live. You can also look through the questions that have been asked and vote for the questions that you would like to have answered. Aurill and Vincent, thank you for joining us today for this session. Now that we have a better idea of the risks involved with volunteer service, perhaps we can take a look at some of the scenarios that charities, SSAs, or volunteer managers may encounter and discuss what are some of the risk management strategies that they can adopt in such circumstances. Perhaps a good place to start would be volunteer recruitment. So some would say that volunteer recruitment is one of the most challenging things a volunteer manager can deal with. And we all know that agencies always are looking for volunteers, not only any volunteer, but good volunteers. And it may become a problem when certain issues with volunteers may not surface during the volunteer recruitment process. So perhaps let us consider this scenario. What if a beneficiary makes certain allegations against a volunteer, such as saying that the volunteer stole from the beneficiary or violated the beneficiary. And we all later found out that this volunteer actually had a criminal record, which the organization failed to pick up during the recruitment process. So perhaps Aurill, you may give us some insight on whether you think the organization can be liable in such a circumstance.
So I guess we're looking at, if you're talking about theft, which is that scenario there, or even a violation, which is potentially criminal, right? I don't think that the organization in the scenario that you've highlighted could be held criminally liable. Like I mentioned, criminal liability is only if the organization is found to have, somehow acted or breached the statute in some way. So in this case, it would seem like the person who's committed the criminal act, if you like, is the volunteer, if at all. If there's any fault to be, attributed to the organization, it might be that it failed to pick up the previous criminal record. That to me sounds and feels like negligence. And so it might be possible that if, let's say, the beneficiary decides to sue the volunteer, and he can then perhaps bring also the organization in for negligence in failing to prevent, but I still think it's fairly remote because these are the sorts of things which I think, go after the volunteer rather than the organization, unless in your scenario, the organization actually knew, that means did a search, found out that this person had a history of theft and, robbery or burglary, and then notwithstanding that, placed this person as a volunteer in an area where he had the exact opportunity to commit these crimes, then I think it might be a very different scenario. Yeah.
Okay, then in such a scenario, would you say that perhaps through the screening process, there needs to be certain kinds of protocol, depending on the searches and the searches that you find and the results that you find? For example, in the scenario that you mentioned, okay, this volunteer has a previous record of theft. In that case, do you think that organizations should have certain protocols to decide how they should allocate certain volunteers in certain areas? And perhaps Vincent can chime in based on your experience as well.
Yeah, thank you. I think I like everyone to take back with one simple framework that I always use. I think it's very practical type, right? Before you even assign a volunteer to anywhere, I know that volunteer centers and even volunteer coordinators for all your different SSAs, usually there is a need that's being triggered to you to recruit volunteers, right? So it's important for VMs or even volunteer coordinator to have, I think you must have adequate understanding about the program and the services which require volunteer and who are the beneficiaries. All right, so usually I go through 4 questions in my head. First question that I normally would ask is, now for the assignment of volunteers to this particular group of beneficiaries, who are the likely vulnerable persons? So that's question number 1, right? And then question number 2 is, now that I know that there are vulnerable persons, what else, what can go wrong? What can go wrong in terms of deployment, in terms of program delivery, right? And then the third question I would ask is, now knowing that if there are some of these things that can go wrong, now I think as a volunteer manager or as a VC, a volunteer coordinator, what are some steps I can work through together with my volunteer to forecast and to mitigate and to prevent? And then the 4th step is, how do I make sure everybody is aware of each other's role? Because when adverse incident happen, what does the beneficiary do? what does the SSA whose program, or the services are being delivered, if they are aware, then what are their responsibility? Then of course, you being the middleman, right? The volunteer manager or the VC or the middleman, what are your obligations, right? So if these are the few simple steps that I hope that people can take away and practice it often. And sometimes you need to have among your team someone to be the devil's advocate. Because I understand when there is a when the ground is very fertile and generally people feel very excited about whether new program or the beneficiaries are reacting positively, we all tend to become a bit more complacent. So it's important to have somebody who always plays a devil's advocate. Now, coming back to the question about in terms of the recruitment and the screening, are there any avenues out there? I think there are, right? But you must go back first to, are your volunteers ready to be deployed first? If you assess that they are ready to be deployed, then of course, then you got to look at this proper screening. Because if some of the work that is going to enter into the space, you have vulnerable population, whether is it an elderly person with dementia or young children, right? So when I say vulnerable population, it means population that could be some even remote possibility of them having been manipulated or exploited. Then I think you must screen them very carefully. In some of the MSF programs, there are screening avenues, meaning that, if you, for example, I think Comlink volunteers, they would be, you can send the volunteer name list to be screened for suitability assessment by MSF, right? But again, we also need to be fair to the volunteers who say, these are part and parcel of our social safeguards. We need your particulars to be screened by the ministry. Would you agree or not? I think this is the least that we need to do. Yeah.
Thank you, Vincent, for providing that avenue. I think many of the participants today will also want to know what are the available avenues that SSAs can have to actually conduct sufficient background checks. So just now you mentioned that there was an avenue through MSF, and would these be only available for vulnerable population, for example, elderly, or does it include children? Is that something that
I think it's still developing. But I know that for vulnerable population defined by MSF, there is the possibility of having the volunteers being screened by them. Some other not so intrusive type of screening can include referencing. We can ask the volunteers for some of their previous volunteering experience with other agencies and obtain such references. I think those are very useful too.
Would you think it's common to ask for referees for volunteers? Because perhaps from a volunteer's perspective, they may think that I'm volunteering my time and you're asking me for like all these references as if I'm applying for a job. So how do you balance that with, the need to want to attract volunteers?
I think it's important for us to be upfront and transparent, that no doubt that we all value and honor our volunteers. They also need to know the context in which their time, the skills, the abilities are going into to serve what cause and which population group. And surely if they understand that on the other end, the recipient could be a vulnerable person, they would also understand and readily accept that safeguards are important. Because it's not just safeguarding the recipients or the beneficiaries, it's also a safeguarding for them, so as to prevent any dispute from happening later on, you see. Yeah. So I find that therein is the role of volunteer managers and volunteer coordinators in your recruitment, in your orientation. It is important to cover those aspects well, and always assure and appreciate the they are coming forward. I personally believe that, you know, volunteerism is really one of the most noble act anybody can get into, because it's really about giving without asking for any returns, right? So I think we have to assure, and in our experience with many of the volunteers, they all understand the need. Right? Yeah.
I was going to say, Kellyn, that apart from referees, right, I would think that a declaration or a confirmation at the point when the volunteer comes in and says, I want to give my name and I want to do this. I mean, I'm sure there will always be an application form, name, address, you know, what do you do? How do you want to help? I don't think it's too much to tag on, you know, a confirmation. I'm not a bankrupt. I've never had any criminal conviction. And then, you know, if any, please, you know, provide some details, right? I don't think that anyone can find that offensive. And I think it would also be very easy to explain that, you know, yeah, we appreciate the efforts of the volunteer wanting to step up. But, you know, we're doing this, all of us are doing this for the good of the beneficiaries. And these questions are asked with the view of protecting the beneficiary. And I think if somebody is really wanting to volunteer, they can understand that. And for the person who cannot understand that and who does not wish to be transparent and open, then I think it does raise the question for the volunteer manager and the organization, do you really want this person on your hands? Yeah.
I think that's a very helpful suggestion, because I guess from the organization's perspective, if anything were to go wrong, and you know, you're blamed for negligence, you can possibly say that, oh, okay, I've asked for this declaration, and this person perhaps fraudulently or lied on the declaration. So in that sense, would you say that it will be helpful to protect the organization's interests?
Okay, I would, but I'm always very, very cautious about anything that is done perfunctorily, right? Because it's not just about ticking the boxes. So for example, you ask the question, have you ever been criminally convicted? Answer yes. Then you have to probe, because you cannot stop there, right? Okay, you have two choices. You can say, because the answer is yes, no, I don't want you as a volunteer. But I would argue that that's not quite an appropriate response too, because, you know, what if the conviction was for something that's totally unrelated? You know, I was a teenager, it was an unlawful assembly, right? Now what I want to do is I just want to, you know, I don't know, do something that's, you know, help out bringing kids to a hike or something like that. So there's got to be some judgment call made. And I think, so that's the thing, you know, sometimes when we ask questions, we're also afraid to ask because you're afraid of the answer that you got. But I think some questions you have to ask. And when the answer comes, you have to follow up, because if you don't follow up, that is still negligence, right? So you follow up and you satisfy yourself based on the information you have, suitable, not suitable, maybe not suitable for this role, get him to do something else. Yeah. So the bankrupt question is also quite important, because, you know, to ask the question, are you a bankrupt? Have you been bankrupted? Is important, because you would know, and I know this may seem wrong, but very often if you have a red flag like that, you would not put the person in any kind of role where they might have to handle money, or for instance, take care of a vulnerable senior, right? Because vulnerable seniors are quite notorious for giving the volunteers their ATM card and say, can you help me take money, right? So you don't want that kind of situation. So a lot of judgment.
I think those are really helpful tips. So on the topic of volunteers, I think many of our participants through questions are very interested to find out what about the engagement of volunteers who are below 21 years old? Because I think many of these people may have come forward. Are there any special safeguards that organizations or volunteer managers should take with regard to these volunteers who may not be 21 years old yet? Perhaps, Vincent, from your experience, is there a way that you will handle such a scenario?
I think it's true that these days you have more and more young people who are interested in stepping up and volunteering, and I think we also need to be mindful about how young we want to go down to. Generally, a good way to start is working through some form of some organizations that they are affiliated to. For example, a school, right? And right at the onset, perhaps start them with a low risk task and observe and assess their maturity in handling different types of situations, right? I think that's important. Thereafter, if we feel quite confident that they can be perhaps emplaced to say provide, I think it's very common, study buddy, right, or academic coaching for another young. You can do that, but importantly, you need to spell out what does the task entail, and then also again work with an adult person, be it a school or a parental figure. I think it's important to do that, right? The observations. So again, don't let it go unsupervised, right? It's important to check in with them regularly. Check in with the beneficiaries regularly about are there any concerns having a volunteer tutor supporting a young child. Ask the young child's parents, right? And that will give you some inclination, right? Yeah, about how suitable and how reliable young volunteers can be.
Aurill, do you have anything to add with regard to a volunteer who may not be 21 years old,
Yeah.
potentially vulnerable as well?
Yeah, I don't think any specific legal liability springs from that, but I can just imagine that, you know, if you had a 14-year-old volunteer, for instance, a study buddy, I think is very safe, but if you were to give the kid, you know, a bigger responsibility, it seems to me that, you know, you could be somehow placing yourself in the difficult position with the kid's parent, right? The volunteer's parent. So I don't know whether certain things might require you to say, can I get your parental consent, for instance? So I can imagine that let's say if you were going to run an activity like, you know, run an overnight camp, for instance, at Changi, right? And you got a 14-year-old who's volunteering. I would imagine that you would say, I need a parental consent for you to go to this camp and to be a volunteer at this camp, right? Because, I mean, think about it. What happens if he got into an accident, or, you know, like the campfire scenario that I was talking about, during the campfire, he got injured? What would the parents say? So there are, I think, some sort of like fuzziness around that for volunteers who are below a certain age. Yeah.
So from what I gather is that perhaps to mitigate such risk of engaging a volunteer who's under 21, we can try to get parental consent for certain types of activities, and also consider the types of activities that such volunteers may be put on, and those preferably with the risk more limited.
Yeah, I was just going to say the tricky one is really, and I haven't thought about this, the tricky one is really the ages of 18 to 21, because the guys are going to tell you, if I'm fit to go to the army, I can do anything. Please don't ask me to ask for parental consent.
Right, but to a certain degree, I guess they will need quite more supervision than those who would be above 21.
I don't know. Do you get many volunteers between 18 and 21? I would
Plenty,
imagine
yeah.
girls would, you know, actually before they go to the uni. I think.
Plenty. I mean,
Yeah.
those in the JC and poly, plenty. Yeah. So yeah, I mean that one is a bit of a gray area, a tricky area, because they are seemingly old enough to be responsible for themselves, and yeah, at the same time, you know, I think under the law they still considered minor, right?
But they can't enter into contracts.
Yeah. So that's that part can be a bit tricky. Yeah. So I think again, go back to originally, simple question that we ask ourselves: where are we deploying volunteers to, and what do we want them to do? Are they equipped to do, and their readiness? And if you are not too sure yet, observe and assign some other different tasks first, right? Don't be pressured and hurried to quickly deploy volunteers. And then that is there where you place yourself at risk of some adverse incident happening. Okay.
Thank you, Vincent. And I'm mindful of the time, so perhaps let's move on to the second scenario on personal data. And there are many, many questions from our participants today on personal data as well. So let us consider the scenario of what if a beneficiary's personal information or their photographs were released by the volunteer or by the agency without the beneficiary's knowledge or consent. So one such scenario could be where in the course of volunteering, volunteers will come in contact with, for example, the beneficiary's family or friends. And in such a scenario, if, say, a volunteer gave the beneficiary's contact number or address to a person who claims to be a beneficiary's friend, but this was done without the beneficiary's consent, and it was later found out that actually the beneficiary didn't want this information to be released. In such a situation, Aurill, would you say that the volunteer has breached some kind of PDPA regulations, and how would the organization come in? Will the organization be considered liable also?
So I think in the scenario that you just gave, obviously there has been a breach of PDPA, right? Because that contact detail is clearly personal data, and you're not supposed to give to anyone. I mean, period, right? And in this scenario, it is intentional giving, right? Even though it seems to be a friendly situation.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps from a volunteer's perspective, it was well-meaning, right? Well-intended, because okay, for somebody to check in on the beneficiary as well, but it turns out that the beneficiary didn't really want that information to be revealed.
Yeah, so this is where I think a protocol is so important, because volunteers, first of all, in terms of how the organization has to manage the information, you really have to go on a need-to-know basis. So therefore, not all your volunteers should have access to the personal data of your beneficiaries, right? Only certain people. And I would argue that if you can, it should be employees. You wouldn't want to give it to your ad hoc volunteers, access to ad hoc volunteers. And ad hoc volunteers, I would imagine that you must have a protocol to say, if for any reason in the course of your volunteering, you receive personal information of the beneficiaries, you must treat it with absolute care. You do not give it to anyone. Right. So in the scenario that you just painted is quite dire, right? And I would hope for the organization that they've had some pretty strict protocol, which somehow this volunteer did not follow, right? And during the onboarding process, again, this thing about having protocols and having rules of conduct, but when you onboard someone, you don't take them through it. This is one of those things you must highlight to the volunteers, that you treat this kind of information with utmost respect. Yeah.
I think in the audience, all of us here are charities or have IPC status, right? It is important to go back to all your agency to find out what are your PDPA policies in your agency. The most sacred of for charities and IPs, for charities and SSAs are our IPC status. IPC status, actually, what does it mean? It basically means that we have earned the trust of the public, right? To be able to provide service and provide care to people. And because of that, there are certain expectations. So adhering to PDPA requirements these days is one of the norm, right? So I urge everybody that you really need to go back to your agency to see whether do you have your PDPA PDPA policy and committee set up? Is there a data protection officer being set up? If there isn't, please sign up with NCSS. Right? They have got course running. I'm also learning myself, right? Because it's a very crucial area, and we don't want to get into trouble. They are quite strict, right? PDPC is quite strict. So once you have all that policy up, you really need to look at, in terms of your protocols, how, not just for your volunteers only, but it will permeate through all the SSA's direct services. So the same way in which how we handle sensitive data of our beneficiaries, right? It should be the same standard volunteers are subjected to. Yeah.
Thanks for that, Vincent. And I suppose other than having a protocol, which the SSAs can seek some guidance from NCSS, the question that I would like to ask is more like, in terms of immediate steps, when such a situation has happened and we know that data or personal information has been leaked, what would you suggest volunteer managers or organizations do immediately to address the issue? And just now, Aurill, you mentioned, there are different camps of whether that you go legalistic camp or whether you go apology camp, and striking a balance in between. What do you think should be the immediate steps that the organization should take to protect its position?
So I'll kick off the discussion, I suppose, because there are so many things that one can do, right? I would think obviously you need to immediately stamp the leak or the wrong. You have to remediate, so you've got to make sure that where the information has been wrongly given out, as much as possible, if you can stop it, you stop it, right? And then you must check, are there other compromises? So in this case, it's quite localized, it's one dissemination. So you can try to go and reach the person to see if you can retrieve it, cancel the message or whatever it is. But if all else fails, then okay, it's gone out, it cannot be helped. I think you have to fess up. Yeah. Definitely. You cannot try to hide it. Hiding is always the worst thing when, there's been a breach, right? It will always be taken against you. It has to be escalated. You have to consider, well, what do I do with this volunteer? Because do I still let this volunteer continue to volunteer? Do I put this volunteer on some kind of suspension? Do I say, thank you very much for your services, but, please don't come in tomorrow? Those are decisions we need to take, right? I think this one is one, and this is just my thoughts, that I think this is the one where you have to be upfront with the beneficiary and say, I'm sorry that this has happened, because it has happened. You can't run away from it. And the sooner you are more upfront about it, the more mitigating steps the beneficiary can take. If for any reason this beneficiary knows that, well, Mr. X asked for my number because of these reasons, then he needs to know that Mr. X has the number, because it could be that he can, the beneficiary will need to take certain steps to protect himself or herself from Mr. X. We don't know if there are nefarious intents behind requesting for that information. So I think total transparency is called for.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Between the volunteer that's being deployed, the SSA that has requested for the volunteer, right, involvement, the SSA also has the responsibility to mitigate the what I call damage, right? Because you really need to attend to ensure that the beneficiary whom the volunteer, right, had unwittingly divulged the personal information to, how is the beneficiary's interest being safeguarded? That has to be the SSA's responsibility. Right? That has to be the SSA's responsibility, because the SSA was the one who had requested for whether whether be it VC or your own internal volunteer coordinator to find a volunteer, right? The SSA ultimately is the one who is responsible. And because the beneficiary is from your SSA and that would constitute a data breach, the SSA is obliged to report to PDPC. Right? Yeah, so that's something that the SSA are obliged to do. will there be repercussion on the staff or on the volunteer manager? Now I think let's always use incidents as a way of learning. So do a what we call after action review, AAR. The people in the army will know it. Always do an AAR and find out what actually went wrong and what were some of the gaps and tidy them up. Yeah. It is through mistakes that we become stronger. Right. So I think this is also something that I want everyone to take away. There are so many different types of risks out there. Some we are already aware, but others can just pop up. Right. It's important that along the way we develop what we call a risk register. For what type of activity, what could be some risks that can come up and at what level, low, moderate, high, and then of course those that are high, well, I don't think we want to proceed if we don't have adequate safeguards. Right? So it's important for us to, over time, document down the different types of activities and volunteer deployment on a risk register. It is impossible to eradicate all risks, and it will be going against what promoting volunteerism is about. Because of the risk, then we are not doing anything. So I don't think that's the way we ought to go. But coming to what Aurill had shared in her presentation is really about managing, mitigating, right? Identifying. So if we've done all that well, I think we can really reduce adverse incidents to the minimum.
Sorry, just to add on about, you talked about immediate steps, Kellyn, right? So I think one of the things that you have to do in a scenario like that is your proper fact find, and then make sure that you record it, because you are going to need it when you report to the authorities. And you will also need an accurate record when you want to decide what to do with the volunteer. Because I would imagine that in all organizations, there has to be a reporting upwards, a decision to be taken. And, to be fair to the volunteer as well, you do want to make sure that you have as complete a set of facts as possible. So you do want to find out, why did it happen? When did it happen? How did it happen? So you want to start putting together a full, accurate record. Have it with you so that you are in a position to answer questions by authorities or your board. You have the information to answer it. It's going to be very hard if, let's say, the decision has been taken to tell the volunteer don't come in, and then then you have to call him up the entire 5 days, in the next 5 days, to say, can you also tell me what happened, why? And then you'll be asking him a whole lot of questions, right? So get that done properly.
Okay, so just now you mentioned, okay, one option is to say, we suspend you, please don't come in temporarily. But what if the situation is slightly different, where the person just stopped volunteering because of this incident? In that case, the participants, many of them would like to know what will happen to the organization if the person who's affected then makes a claim against the organization.
So in this case, right, of an information breach, like we were talking about earlier, there will be repercussions, regulatory repercussions under the PDPA, and those ones will be imposed by PDPC, okay?
And this will be against the organization.
It will be against the organization, okay? Then the question there is, what if the victim decides to take action? Okay, so the victim could take action.
Like filing a civil
the
claim,
statutory tort
yes,
action.
yeah.
The victim could also lodge a complaint, right? Yeah. So that would be the whole gamut of reputational repercussions, right? And I guess if the victim, and if it's a huge enough breach, the organization could seriously be looking at conditions being imposed that could curtail its ability to do certain things.
Just now you mentioned during your overview that, if an organization can show that they have reasonable security arrangements, then maybe there's one of the defenses in a way that they can raise if a report were to be made. And would you say that perhaps making the volunteer sign a confidentiality agreement, will you think that will help with these reasonable security
I
arrangements?
think it's going to be a holistic, fact-sensitive inquiry as to whether, there is no one-size-fits-all sort of approach to what would be reasonable security arrangements. It depends on what information you are taking. And there will be many layers of steps that you can take. So definitely, getting your volunteers to sign confidentiality agreements, or at least agreements whereby they acknowledge that they are aware that this is information that is confidential, is one important component, right? Education is important as well, right? Like I said, the onboarding process is very important. If you make people sign pieces of paper and they don't bother to read it, and you don't sort of like properly orientate them, then I don't think it's going to stand as very much of a defense when you have a whole bunch of volunteers who keep on breaching the PDPA, because PDPC will look at you and say, yeah, obviously you've got all these beautifully written, policies, but nobody knows anything about it. Nobody is complying with it. There's something seriously wrong, right? So I think it's a whole gamut of things you have to do. It's the culture. You have to make everybody aware that, hey, all these things are confidential information. When we take photographs, it's important that we don't just post it. We get people to agree that we can use these photographs, right? So I was really impressed the other day. There was a walkabout in my estate, right? And after the walkabout, someone came up to me and said, ma'am, photograph was taken just now. Are you okay for us to use it if we want to use it? I thought that was really good, because, most of the times it just happens, right? I mean, if you're in a shopping center or something like that, people take photographs and they just use it. They don't ask you. But I thought that was very disciplined. And I think if organizations do this for all the events that they run, then your volunteers and your staff see it and they'll say, oh, this is the way we respect people's information. So I think it's not just, like I say, one exercise, one piece of paper, one tick in the box. It's everything. It's the whole approach.
I want to encourage the VM community, because we are a community here, that there are actually so many good practices out there that we may not be aware of what's happening with one another. And I think after today, don't just leave and forget, or go back and then you again reinvent your own wheels. I think network, set up practice circles, share good practices. The different VCs, you can invite fellow VCs to come and observe how you do onboarding, how you do recruitment, and share it around, because this is how we build knowledge and we build the community together.
I think that's very right. So knowledge sharing is really important I think in every industry. So I'm mindful of the time. So let's really take a look at one last scenario. And this is regarding whether during the interactions between volunteer and beneficiary, and if a beneficiary expresses some thoughts or information that may be concerning, what should the volunteer do, or when should it be escalated to the agency level? So certain examples that we have given would be, for example, a beneficiary whose child told the volunteer that, oh, my parents would punish me or beat me from time to time or regularly. Or, for example, a teenager even complaining about the mother's constant nagging and told the volunteer, if I could, I would make her disappear, for example. What are the circumstances do you think volunteers should surface all these information or scenarios to the SSA, or even to the authorities, for example, the police? Aurill, any thoughts?
So I just want to say that I see this not so much from a legal liability point of view. Okay, so obviously under the law, there are certain types of offenses which, if you know someone has the intention to commit, you, the person knowing it, have a responsibility to report it to the police, okay? But these types of offenses are not of the type that you just mentioned. Okay, these types of offenses are things like robbery, offenses against the state. They're very serious. There's a whole list, okay? I couldn't possibly sort of recite for you here, but I would say that there is a whole list of offenses which you have to actually report. I think what do you call that? Corruption is one of them. I think unlawful assembly is another. Offenses against the state, counterfeiting, those types of offenses. It's not of the type of I might harm my mother or I might take my own life. Okay, so in these types of scenarios, I also think that the first point of concern ought not to be, what do I need to do to protect myself so that I'm not criminally liable? I think the first sort of issue is there someone who is at risk that I need to protect? It's got nothing to do with the law, so to speak, right? Is there someone I need to escalate to? And I think on this issue, I will defer to Vincent.
When volunteers are deployed, and again, we have already identified that there are vulnerable persons, right? And some of the potential risks that could happen is harm to the vulnerable person, then the volunteers must constantly be reminded on what are the channels of escalation, right? For volunteers, it's important. The message that we need to get through to the volunteers would be that don't be dismissive and take it lightly. Whenever a potential comment is being made that could compromise a person's safety or harm, or potential harm can happen, right? So, and it is also not fair for them to hold the information on their own, because they are deployed by agency to support, be it a vulnerable person or family, right? So therein, the SSA, again, coming back, it is the SSA who has asked for volunteers to come and augment and support their work. The SSA must be ready, must have the necessary protocols in place that to allow for escalation. Usually what happens would be that the volunteer, after they have spotted such behavior, right? They have a channel to escalate up, and then the SSAs quite likely will send a professional person to go in and do a more thorough assessment. That's usually the case, right? That's usually the case. And by doing so, usually the volunteer would have exited because it would have handed over to, Now, sometimes when these incidents happen, I would say that it actually prevents something even more sinister from happening, because it means that the volunteer would have also played a role of being the eyes and ears to watch out for vulnerable population, some of the potential harm or some of the harm that already been taken place, but the beneficiaries had never told anyone, right? But until they found that they have forged a certain level of comfort and trust, that they surface to the volunteer. And then this is where then the SSAs can get to pick up such kind of cases and then do a thorough assessment. And sometimes good outcomes actually happen from it, because it could be the incident of child abuse, it could be incidents of family violence, and then it gets surfaced up to the professional team, and then the professional team can take it from there and handle from there, right? So we should not take it that each time when something, some adverse incident information that's being shared to the volunteer, then volunteer center or volunteer manager are in trouble. Actually, it's not the case, right? Actually, it's not the case.
I think we have tried to answer the questions raised by the participants throughout this seminar. Perhaps just one overarching last question for Aurill and Vincent to give your views on before we wrap up. I think we have talked a lot about, the steps that like SSAs and volunteer managers can take, the 4 steps raised by Vincent, coming up with protocols, perhaps some kind of confidentiality agreements or forms. It sounds like quite a lot, right? So I guess the question is, how do we adequately protect the agency without having to introduce all these very more onerous legal documentation or administrative work on the agency's end? So how would you think this balance can be struck?
I think always go back to the intent on why certain services, programs are being organized. And in relation to this, because volunteers are being tapped upon, right? So when we are clear about the intent of the program and services and who we are serving and how the volunteer can come in to support, then we will be a lot clearer about the potential risk, right? Good practice, I mentioned about the risk register. Good practice, start logging your risk register first, right? Do it as a practice, and then over time, we will as a community be able to compare and share notes to share on what kind of population are most prone to what type of risk, and what kind of mitigation efforts can be the most practical for all of us to handle. We don't want it to be too onerous to a point where then volunteerism get killed. There's no volunteerism. We also don't want volunteerism to be so organic and totally unregulated, where the most vulnerable segment of our population can at any time be taken advantage of. I think these 2 extremes we want to avoid.
Thanks, Vincent. Aurill?
Kellyn, that's a very difficult question. I felt like it was like an A-level question saying, what did you learn in the last 2 years from your physics syllabus? Then do it in 5 pages. I think one thing that I felt really resonated with me was when Vincent said that this is about a community, and he said learn from each other. And I think that is so true. In something like risk management, there is no perfect answer. You don't want to go over the top. You don't want to be underprepared. And so how do you do it properly? I think the only way you can do it properly and well and hit the sweet spot, so to speak, in terms of what needs to be done, is that there is constant sharing as a community, constant learning from each other as a community. And I think what is being organized today is important. You do need forum like that where you're just talking about the foundational information. It's like an information download thing. And then beyond that, it's about practicing it. And the only way you can practice it well is if you are talking as a community and you are challenging each other and you're sharing experiences and saying, I've got this, how did you resolve, your similar situation? And then you build upon it. And then I think you will have a better protocol for due diligence, a better protocol for screening. As a community, you will have a better protocol for how do we escalate, concerning information, so to speak. So it's going to have to be built step by step. And it's great that, you've got the SG Care umbrella to sort of help you along. But, obviously there's some way to go, but this is such solid, foundation to start with, I think.
Thank you. And we have come to the end of our panel discussion. Thank you, Aurill and Vincent, for your time and for your invaluable insights. And also thank you to the audience in person as well as on Zoom for your participation and all your questions. We apologize we weren't able to handle all your questions, and there were so many of them. So perhaps like what Aurill and Vincent suggested, more of such platforms will have to come up in the future for us to better address those. And also, as a natural progression of our discussion just now, we would like to inform everybody in person here that photographs have been taken of you today. So if you have any issues with it, please let any of the SG Cares people here know, and we'll deal with that separately. Okay, we also would want to bring up this volunteer continuity planning guide that NCSS has prepared. You can scan it on screen and you'll be able to access it. This is a comprehensive guide to provide SSAs with information on planning your own personalized volunteer continuity plan for your organization. So this aims to help you plan for continuity of volunteer activities during service disruptions by diversifying your volunteer resources and equipping the volunteers with the relevant skills that will be in demand during a crisis. And this step-by-step guide also includes a workbook that you can scan and access it as well. So the last point is that we would really appreciate your feedback for today's session. For those of you on site here, our SG Cares staff will provide you with a QR code to scan. And for those of you online, you will get a link with the feedback form after you close the browser for this webinar. So with that, on behalf of Law Society Pro Bono Services and SG Cares Office, thank you for joining us today, and we hope you have a great afternoon. Thank you.